On July 13th, aircraft from the Saudi-led coalition put at least 5 airstrikes into Sana'a International Airport, 3 of them onto the runway itself. The same day, the Houthis fired dozens of ballistic missiles and drones at Abha International Airport in southern Saudi Arabia. According to Human Rights Watch, which verified the strikes using satellite imagery, these were the first coalition strikes in Yemen since the truce that began in April 2022. A 4-year understanding broke in a single afternoon. 12 days later, the Houthis hit Saudi Aramco facilities at Jizan and Yanbu. On that same day, a Houthi delegation sat down with Saudi officials in Oman. So in this video, we're going to explain how an argument about one airport ended with missiles hitting oil tankers, why the oil market calmed down while the shooting continued, and why the most expensive thing here is not a missile. Never miss an episode. Hit subscribe, ring the bell, and stay in the loop. Let's start with why Saudi Arabia's oil is suddenly sailing past Yemen. Until this year, most Saudi crude left through the Persian Gulf and the Strait of Hormuz. The U.S. Energy Information Administration measured that passage at 20.9 million barrels a day, roughly 20% of world petroleum consumption. The war between the United States and Iran changed that. Transits through Hormuz collapsed from about 28 vessels a day in early July to around 10 from July 8th onward, and Saudi Arabia pushed a large share of its exports west instead, out of the Red Sea port of Yanbu. By July, according to the Atlantic Council, Yanbu was handling around 4 million barrels a day, roughly 5 times its level before the Iran war. At the southern end of that sea, the Bab el-Mandeb was carrying over 7 million barrels a day, close to 7% of global supply. That is the fact that explains the timing of everything else, and it has almost nothing to do with Yemen. The Bab el-Mandeb runs along the Yemeni coast, past territory the Houthis control. The group did not acquire a new weapon this month, it acquired a new target. To see why that matters, you need the arrangement it interrupted. In April 2022, the United Nations brokered a truce. It formally lapsed that October, but in practice it held for close to 4 years, in 2 halves. No coalition airstrikes inside Yemen, and no Houthi missiles into Saudi Arabia. By Ekled's count, the Houthis had not attacked a merchant ship since September 2025. What broke all of that was an airport. On July 3rd, an Iranian civilian aircraft landed at Sana'a, in territory the Houthis hold, the first to do so in roughly a decade. Yemen's internationally recognized government called it a violation of sovereignty and asked the Security Council for an urgent meeting. 10 days later, coalition aircraft cratered the runway to stop a second flight from landing. Houthi media blamed Saudi Arabia directly, while the coalition's own account attributes the operation to Yemeni government forces, a distinction Riyadh has been careful to preserve. The Houthi answer arrived at Abha within the day, and their military spokesman Yahya Sari said the exchange had ended the de-escalation phase the two sides had kept since 2022. On July 20th, the group declared a maritime blockade of Saudi Arabia, effective immediately, framing it as the right of the Yemeni people to answer a blockade with a blockade. Then, the shooting moved offshore. On July 22nd, missiles and drones hit the tankers Insilia and Layla, setting a fire aboard the Insilia, with both crews reported safe. Coalition strikes on Hodeidah followed on July 24th, the Aramco facilities on July 25th, and missiles at the tanker NCC Ghazal on July 28th. At which point, an obvious question is what all of this actually cost, and the answer is stranger than the timeline suggests. Brent crude went from $68.53 a barrel on July 2nd to $105.32 on July 23rd, a rise of 54%. It then fell back to $91.82 by July 27th, about 13% off the peak. The OVX index, a traded price for how much turbulence the oil market expects, ran from 40.33 on July 6th to 68.97 on July 23rd, then eased to 57.15 by July 28th. Both series peaked on the same day, and both have fallen since, while the attacks continued. One caution before reading too much into that. Hormuz transits had already collapsed by July 8th, before any of this began, so the war between the United States and Iran is doing most of the work in that price. The Red Sea escalation added to a war premium that was already there rather than creating one. Shipping tells a similar story. The IMF's PortWatch, which counts transits from ship transponder data, had the Bab el-Mandeb averaging about 35 vessels a day through June and early July. Over the 3 days to July 26th, that fell to 24, roughly 31% down. The important detail is when the fall started. Traffic was essentially flat after the July 13th airport exchange and only dropped around July 24th, tracking the tanker attacks and something much less visible than a missile. That something is insurance. War risk cover for a voyage through the southern Red Sea was priced at 0.3% of a ship's hull value before around July 20th. By July 22nd, it was 0.75%, and by July 24, it was over 1%. Out of the southern ports of Jizan and Al-Shuqaiq, it was quoted as high as 3%, against roughly 0.1% for Jeddah and Yanbu, a few hundred miles up the same coastline. Even the small moves add hundreds of thousands of dollars to a 7-day voyage, and several major insurers suspended cover for Saudi-linked vessels altogether. Not one ship has been sunk, and nobody has died at sea across the 4 publicly identified vessel attacks. A blockade that cannot sink a tanker can still price it out of the route, and underwriters are slower to come back than gunners are to stop. Which brings us to the part that gets the least attention, because both sides appear to be pulling their punches. The coalition spokesman, called the July 24th Operation Proportionate, announced that it had ended and said Yemen's main commercial ports remained open. On the other side, Aklidi noted 2 China-bound ships carrying Saudi crude passing through the Bab el-Mandeb unharmed on July 23rd, which suggests some vessels are being deliberately exempted, and which makes for a curious sort of blockade. The reason for the restraint is that nobody ever left the table. The UN Special Envoy, Hans Grunberg, was in Muscat on July 14th meeting the Houthis chief negotiator, and in Riyadh 5 days later. That channel has 3 issues on it: the airport, the naval blockade, and humanitarian provisions. So what is this exactly? There are 2 explanations, and the sources genuinely split. The first is that the blockade is a negotiating tactic, a way of extracting concessions on the airport by making the Red Sea expensive. ACLED's Sherwin Hindreen Ali called it a significant escalation, while noting that the Houthis have left themselves room to climb back down. The second is that it is groundwork for a renewed war. The Atlantic Council's Alison Miner allows for both readings, warning that the region is fragile enough to push Yemen into an all-out war regardless of what either side intends. She also doubts the Houthis can sustain strikes at the range of Yanbu, some 800 miles from the territory they hold. The two are not mutually exclusive. A blockade built as leverage and a blockade built as a prelude look identical for the first several weeks, which is a large part of what makes one useful. This is the fundamental dilemma facing Saudi Arabia, and the main constraint is not a shortage of aircraft. Its oil is now leaving through a strait its opponent can reach, which means every strike it lands inside Yemen also tells underwriters that the southern Red Sea is a war zone. Hitting hard enough to stop the launches would raise the price of ensuring the very route its exports have been redirected onto. Doing nothing concedes that a group it has been unable to defeat on the ground can put a price on Saudi cargo leaving Saudi ports. In the short term, the market's judgment is visible in the price. That fall has continued through every attack since, including the Aramco strikes and the tanker hit on July 28th. It is the clearest single indication that professional risk pricers read this as bounded, and neither analyst quoted here calls it a restart. Over the longer term, the arithmetic is worse. The April 2022 understanding held for close to 4 years, and both halves of it were broken inside a single day. So the threshold for the next round now sits lower than it did. Insurance, as we have seen, is slower to reverse than a ceasefire. And the baseline underneath all of this has not moved. As of July 21st, 22.3 million Yemenis, more than half the population, needed humanitarian assistance, and the 2026 response plan was 19% funded. The most likely next step is not a ground offensive. It is some arrangement over the airport that started this, traded for quiet at sea, though nothing of the kind was agreed in Muscat, and the blockade is still in force. What has actually changed here is smaller than a war and harder to undo than one. For 4 years, neither side shot at the other, because neither had a reason worth the cost. The disruption of the Strait of Hormuz supplied the reason, and it did so by moving Saudi Arabia's oil into range. That's all for today. Your daily shot of the world.